In mid-afternoon, we came to a crowd on the northwest side of Mount Tabor. As we approached the crowd, the woman said, "I don't see the teacher, but I see his disciples." She greeted the disciples, and they were glad to see her. My father studied the disciples. They dressed simply. Some of them were even a little tattered. They were not exalted men. They were sweaty vineyard men, haggling marketplace men. They were sunburnt hands that pulled heavy nets into fishing boats. In her presence, the disciples told the crowd about the widow of Nain and her son. Soon she was answering questions from those who had come to see Jesus. After she had answered questions for much of an hour, she brought Father and me to the disciples. Father told them why he had come. He asked if he could see Jesus. A disciple said that Jesus had climbed Mount Tabor to pray, and that he had left that morning at sunrise. But he said, "You don't have to wait for him. We have authority to cast out demons. We've had this authority from the Almighty ever since Jesus sent us out in pairs to towns and villages to heal the sick and to cast out demons. When we came back, Jesus had said that he had seen Satan fall from heaven." I was in front of Father, and he had his hands on my shoulders. He asked the disciple who said this, "Please, would you help my boy? He has suffered for so long that it is hard to imagine him without his torment." But listening to this woman, he looked at the widow of Nain, who stood next to him. "She has made me hope. So have you." The disciple fixed his eye on me. The crowd grew still. The disciple said, "Deaf and mute spirit, come out of this boy." Someone in the crowd asked, "Did something happen?" The disciple spoke to me, but I couldn't hear him. He appeared puzzled. I twisted around and looked at my father. He looked at me. He looked disappointed. A second disciple stepped forward. The first disciple stepped back. The second disciple asked, "Unclean spirit, what is your name?" I saw his lips move, but just like the first disciple, that only confused me. He seemed to be talking to me, and I wondered why. The first disciple told the second disciple, "He's deaf. He can't hear you." Another disciple on his other side said, "He's mute. He couldn't speak to you either." The disciple standing in front of me looked at each of them and nodded his head. I looked behind me up at my father. He looked sad and tired. The disciples conferred together. They told my father that they would try again later. We spent the night next to Mount Tabor. Some in the crowd had tents, but Father and I slept in the open. The next morning, sick people from the crowd presented themselves to the disciples. The disciples anointed them with oil, and they were healed. Father saw this, and it made him hopeful again. But the disciples tried again to cast the demon out of me, and they failed. The next day was sunny, as it had been the day before and the day before that. But in mid-morning, a dark cloud quickly came down from the top of Mount Tabor and covered the mountain. Everybody backed away. Even though we were next to it, we couldn't see Mount Tabor for the cloud. I couldn't hear, but Father told me later that there was thunder. There was lightning, too. The cloud was a dense gray, but the lightning made it, for the blink of an eye, brilliantly white. I could feel the earth shake under my feet. Some people said that they heard long blasts from a trumpet. Others heard only the thunder. People covered their ears. Some fell face down on the ground, some hid in their tents, and others raced away from the mountain. The thunder and lightning stopped. The cloud disappeared. Light and warmth dazzled us. People came out of their tents. The ones who had flung themselves down stood up, and the ones who had run away came back. Everybody gazed at the rainbow over the mountain. For a time, people talked about what had just happened, but when the immediate excitement of the cloud and the lightning and the thunder had waned, all of the disciples who were there at the foot of the mountain surrounded me. Together they worked to free me from my torment. Still, they could not cast out the demon. Then 3 men from the crowd came and stood between the disciples and me. The first man complained to the disciples that they were wrong to do what they were trying to do. He said, "The lad's parents must have sinned, or he himself sinned. That's why a deaf and mute spirit harms him. Ask his father about his impiety, or ask about his lack of faith, because it had made his son deaf to God. You men are trying to interfere with heaven's judgment." My father winced. Then the second scribe said his father should say whether the boy was a liar or a blasphemer. The Almighty, in his vast power and deep wisdom, has rebuked him by taking away his power of speech. Some of the crowd murmured that this was right. My father began to protest, but the 3 scribes shouted him down. The third scribe said, "There is one cure and only one cure. A goat or a lamb must be sacrificed. It is a sin offering as written in the book of Leviticus. Anything else will fail." The disciples argued back. But the scribes said, "If you can cast out this demon, then cast it out." The argument spread into the crowd, and soon almost everyone was engaged in a fury of shouting. Father did not join in the argument. He sat on the ground and wept into his hands. He sobbed over and over that he only wanted his son to be well. The widow of Nain knelt next to him. He did not see her, and he could not hear her above the shouting. Years of sorrow had bent his thoughts toward hopelessness. Any path toward hope had always circled back to where it had started, as it did at that moment. In the chaos of shouting, Jesus and 3 other disciples came upon us from the direction of Mount Tabor. When the crowd became aware of him, they stopped shouting at each other, and the scribes and the disciples stopped arguing. The crowd ran to Jesus and begged to know what had happened on the mountain. Jesus didn't say. He wanted to know what the shouting was about. Other people had been crowding forward to speak with Jesus, but when they saw that he was vexed, and when they heard what he asked, they drew back. My father walked up to Jesus. He said that he had brought his son to him because I had a demon. He said that the disciples had tried to free me from the demon, but they couldn't. Jesus called us a faithless generation. He asked how much longer he would be among us and how long he would have to put up with us. Then he said to bring me to him. He walked away from the crowd, and Father followed him. Most of the crowd were more curious about what had happened on the mountain than about what would happen to me, and they were cowed by Jesus' rebuke. So instead of crowding Jesus, they crowded the 3 disciples that had come down with Jesus. They pleaded for an explanation of the cloud, the lightning, and the thunder. The widow of Nain and her son led me to my father and Jesus. They had stopped next to a small house. That's the last thing that I remember until I woke up. The demon seized me, and I started rolling on the ground, and my mouth foamed. Jesus looked at me on the ground and then at my father. He asked how long this had been happening to me. Father said that the way that Jesus asked that question helped him to grasp Jesus' sympathy for us. My father told him that it had happened since I was a small boy. He told Jesus about the burnings and the almost drownings. My father pleaded with Jesus to have mercy on us, to make me well if he could. Jesus was astonished. He said that God could do anything for one who believed. Exhaustion, brought about by constant sorrow, had drained my father's faith. His faith was tiny enough to be lost between the tips of his thumb and forefinger. He said, "I believe." His eyes searched the ground when he said that. Then he looked in Jesus' eyes and pleaded, "Help my unbelief." He did not know it then, but that was a prayer. The crowd shifted its attention to us. They came running to where I still foamed from my mouth and writhed on the ground. Jesus told the spirit that caused me to be deaf and mute to come out of me and never to enter me again. I screamed, and I convulsed horribly. After that, I had the stillness and pallor of a corpse. My father stared at me, motionless on the ground. Some in the crowd said that I was dead. He heard them say that. He dropped to his knees. He bent from his waist, covered his face with his hands, and he bowed his face to the ground next to my face. He stayed like that for a minute, silent. Then Jesus stooped and took my hand. I became aware again. I felt his hand. The first thing that I heard was the breeze shaking the leaves in nearby trees. Then I heard the caw of a raven. I opened my eyes. I sat up. Someone said, "Look!" My father looked up. His eyes widened. Jesus helped me stand. It was hard because my legs were shaky. My father got to his feet too. I looked up at my father's face and said, "Papa." On the way home, we talked about what had happened. Father did most of the talking for weeks. It wearied me if I talked too long, and it made my throat ache. Father told me that he was greatly comforted by the fact that Jesus told the spirit not to enter me again. He said that it was hard enough to believe that the horror was over after it had been part of his life, day after day, for 5 years. He said that if Jesus hadn't said that, he would have dreaded that one day the demon would come back. As we walked, I listened to Father sing psalms. He listened to me sing, too. He said that my songs were sweet to his ear. He said, "Your voice is not the same as it was when you could speak before. Of course, you are older now." We got home. Mother wept for joy. That day, neighbors came and went. They praised God, but in lonely, late evening lamplight, Mother and Father sat across from each other at our table. I sat between them. Father rested his hands on the table in front of him. Mother said that what had happened made her think of the prophet Elijah. Especially, she thought of Elijah's contest at Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. She said, Elijah told the people to choose between God and Baal. He said that the prophets of Baal should make an altar, sacrifice a bull on it, and call down fire from their god. Elijah said that he would do that too, and whichever god sent fire, that was the god the people should follow. The priests of Baal stacked the wood on the altar, killed their bull, and put the bull on the wood. Then they called fire down from heaven. They called on their god for hours. They sliced their backs with swords, but nothing happened. Then Elijah cut up a bull, and he put the wood and the sacrifice on the altar. Elijah told the people to soak the altar with 4 buckets of water. He made them do that 3 times. Then Elijah prayed. God sent down fire. It consumed the sacrifice. The fire even licked the water from the trench around the altar. Mother said, our own fear and doubts were like the buckets of water that soaked the wood, the sacrifice, and the altar. But this prophet Jesus was unburdened by our fears and doubts. He called the power of heaven, like Elijah had called down the lightning of God to take Elijah's offering for the sins of the people. Father protested that he had had enough faith to take me to Nain and to Mount Tabor. Mother stretched her arms across the table, pressed her small hands on top of his big hands, and beamed into his face. The next day, Father and I were sitting under our oak tree. The 3 men from the north came. We saw them coming when they were far off. When they came close, Father stood and shouted, "But if you don't wish to serve the Lord, then today choose whom you will serve, the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river, or the gods of the Ammonites in whose land you stand." Then I stood up. I shouted, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." I picked up a rock and threw it at them. It bounced off the oracle's shoulder. Then they turned and ran. I chased them for a mile, throwing rocks at their backs. Later, when we learned how Jesus' clothes and face had changed on Mount Tabor, we also learned that God had spoken to the disciples who were with him. On Mount Sinai, God gave Moses the law. On Mount Tabor, God told Peter, John, and James to listen to Jesus. My father did listen. In time, he felt called to come here, into Samaria. He traveled here to spread the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the God who heals, the God who raises the dead. This Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. God brought him back from death and took him up to heaven. He sits at the right hand of God. The 36 bandits continued to listen. Father made several trips to this land. The last trip he made, he never came back from. I am my father's son. I come here in my father's place. You can kill me, but that will get you nothing of lasting worth. Or you can let me baptize you in the name of Jesus Christ by water and the Spirit. Then you will have no fear of death, because your resting place will be in heaven with God. Blessed be his name forever. Amen.